after all the consultation process and design change and so on and so forth, as you all know, business record checks went live earlier this year, and people still, I think, don't quite know what to make of them. They sort of think, well, you know, it's just the revenue coming around, having a look at your records. It's not a particularly big deal, it's very low level, and so on and so forth. This is a mistake, because there are no randomly selected cases taken up for business record checks. All cases selected for a business record check have failed a risk analysis test. In other words, if your client gets a business record check letter saying we want to come around and have a look at your letter, have a look at your records, what that means is that the revenue actually think that there is something wrong with their tax affairs that is worth looking at. So alarm bells should ring loud and clear. The problem, of course, with business record checks is that they are backed with a penalty regime. It's Section 12B of Taxes Management Act 1970, and there is a penalty of up to £3,000 for business records that fail to meet the statutory requirements. Now, this is a very interesting penalty, this one, because it was initially brought in 1994 at the start of self-assessment, and the purpose of it was for to make people keep their records. And in fact, in the entire period from when it was first enacted until business record checks started, I don't think that a single penalty has ever been levied under Section 12B, because it was reserved for cases where people had torched their records rather than let the revenue see them. You know, it's really sort of extreme cases of evasive non-compliance. And I described right at the earlier, I said, well, this surely is a penalty fossil. And their policy specialist said, well, actually, yes, it has been. You know, this is just not a penalty that's been used. But nowadays, they are intending to use it. And for a business that is not in its first year of trading, if the test is failed, then the starting penalty is 500 quid, escalating if they come back and find there's still something wrong, up to the maximum of 3,000. So it can get very expensive, particularly when you realise that this is aimed at the sector of small businesses, the 2.4 million small businesses with turnover of less than £20,000. In that context, 500 quid's an awful lot of money for getting your records wrong. And so, but the important point to bear in mind is that even though there is this penalty risk, there is serious doubt as to whether or not HMRC can legally charge those penalties. Because the test is that you have to keep the records that are requisite for the purpose of making a correct and complete return. And requisite doesn't just mean required, it's a special word meaning required of necessity. So in other words, it implies an element of choice into the records that you keep. And if you haven't kept the records that are requisite for the purpose of keeping a correct, making a correct and complete return, then you get charged a penalty. And so the revenue think that they can just go along tomorrow, find that the records are inadequate. If the records are not raised to a standard which they feel is acceptable within a 3-month period, they will levy a penalty. And we say that's wrong. When I say we, I say me and the CIOT with me, because when you think about it, how can you tell, without ever having seen the return, whether or not the records are requisite for the purpose of making a correct and complete return? You can't. Because by the end of the year, any shortcomings in the records may have been spontaneously rectified. It may in any case be that although the revenue will take a different view about the completeness of the records and all the rest of it, you as accountants are able to produce a set of accounts and a return, which is most certainly correct within the civil evidential standard of a balance of probabilities, which of course is all that is required for tax purposes. We are not talking about, getting the thing totally right. We are talking about having a set of accounts that is sustainably correct by reference to that standard. And so, therefore, charging penalties mid-year before the return has even been submitted is axiomatically out of kilter with what the law actually requires. This is a post-return penalty. And the other point, of course, is double jeopardy. Let us say, for example, that you go around this, which is linked, I suppose, to the point that I've just made about it being a post-return obligation. Let's say that your client's return, he's charged a penalty for having duff records in the course of the year, and then his return's taken up for inquiry, and it transpires that his return is indeed wrong. He hasn't recorded his cash properly, or whatever it might be, and his return is therefore inaccurate. And it will be inaccurate because of a careless failure, or possibly a deliberate failure, to keep adequate records. And so therefore, the penalty that he is charged for the inaccurate return will also, inevitably, how on earth can you possibly separate it as a sort of, act of mental agility? It will inevitably contain an element that is referable to inadequate records. And so therefore, you have two penalties bearing on exactly the same subject matter, which must A, be objectionable, but B, imply that the Revenue's interpretation of how they can use this penalty in this context is wrong. Of course, these discussions have opened up the larger point, which is that it might yet be possible to charge a penalty on top of a careless inaccuracy penalty after the return has been submitted. That one is still being discussed. But there is a serious issue about double jeopardy, which everybody admits is something that would be unacceptable. And of course, the other problem is, what are adequate records? The interesting thing in here is that the Revenue completely refused to accept that incomplete records are ever acceptable. So they will not accept that incomplete records are ever good enough. They will always be inadequate. But nonetheless, they accept that records don't have to be gold-plated records, and therefore, you have probably seen all the sort of various examples of adequacy of records, all of which are sort of written over the presupposition that, in fact, even though the sort of apparent form of the records might not be what the Revenue wants to see, they are nonetheless complete. Because incomplete records are something, even though it said to the Revenue, well, look, why don't you say, given that it's a fact of life for all small businesses, that incomplete records, as long as they're not laughably incomplete or ones from which you can't compile a set of accounts properly, why don't you say that, in fact, that's okay? But that is something that they won't do. And instead, we have these rather fatuous debates about whether records are adequate or inadequate, not, of course, a word that features in the legislation at all. And it makes you particularly concerned when you see that in one of the Revenue's employer compliance guides, they give examples of records that officers should see as unsatisfactory, as including untidy or unanalysed records. So that's, 90% of your clients, I would have thought. Or records written up more than 4 weeks in arrear. That's the other 10%. These are just entirely unrealistic, and this is still in their published guidance. I just checked the other day, and there it is. Cash books not written up contemporaneously, because of the possibility of memory failure and so on and so forth. No record of cash drawings, that mythical beast that no small trader ever keeps. So there is a vast gulf between what we as professionals would accept as adequate records and what HMRC expect to see when they go around and undertake one of these reviews. So one needs to be mindful of this, and in particular to make sure that you are there on hand to protect your client and to demonstrate the adequacy of the records in a taxed way, which your clients are going to be absolutely unable to do. So what does a record check entail? Those cases that I've come across where the visits have taken place between the client or taxpayer and HMRC, what you tend to get is the business record check really being quite cursory and at least as much time being spent talking to the guy about how he runs his business. Tell me about your business, what's your pattern and so on. In other words, all sort of questions that you used to be familiar with in the context of an investigation interview. And that sort of information is certainly something that cannot but inform their sort of future view of risk as regards that taxpayer in the future. So and this, I suppose, is why I say about this. That if one of these things is started, your client has failed some sort of test somewhere. That is just why you get chosen. It's never randomly selected. Every single case is selected for a reason. And so therefore, one really does have to come in and engage. And when you look at exactly how it works and what they say, you realise what sort of businesses they're interested in here. What they're interested in are the traditional investigation soft touches, you know, the small cash businesses, which, you know, habitually have poor records and are sort of the cannon fodder of investigation, really, historically. Because the approach, first of all, is to write a letter and say, right, can we talk to the taxpayer? You know, we're going to ring you up and ask you a bit about your business records. And when if you actually do that, what you get, first of all, is a set of what they call segmentation questions, which ask you questions which are designed to assess what your general views on, you know, sort of compliant behaviour and your general feeling about paperwork is. You know, they say things like, for example, you know, do you like filling out forms? You know, do you feel? I mean, this is a good one. Do you feel that you're fulfilling all your obligations for tax purposes? I mean, you'd be a brave man if you put your hand up to that. But nonetheless, that's what they do. And all of these things are marked. So it's, you know, yes, no, you get a particular score. And then they go on to more sort of business-focused questions, which are these, basically. What percentage of your of your sales are cash? And what percentage of them, of your purchases are in cash? How often do you write up your records? How do you identify non-business elements of expenditure that you incur? This sort of thing. In other words, again, all the things that will be familiar to those who have been dealing with revenue investigations in the past. And so you can see exactly what these people, what they're focusing on. The interesting thing is when they first started doing this, the answer to what percentage of your sales is in cash, the only options available to the people on the telephone were 100%, 50% or none. And so you get people who you know, had probably 5 or 10% of their sales in cash, and you know, they were sort of thinking, well, we can't say none because it's a lie. And the people on the phone would go, oh, I'll just put 50% then. And you sort of think, well, and of course, guaranteeing themselves a business record check as a result. So we have managed to get them to, you know, make their response range a bit more realistic. So that's some progress. And then depending on the mark that flows out of this sort of checklist test, which is not incidentally done by a tax specialist, this is, you know, just sort of a person on the telephone, then either you get no further action, in which case you can probably relax because the revenue sphere of risk has been allayed, or you get what is rather sinisterly referred to as an educational visit, or if they really think it sounds a bit dodgy, you get a full compliance visit when they actually want to come around, look at the records in real time, talk to the taxpayer and so on and so forth. Well, of course that's not an ideal state of affairs, particularly not if there actually is something that requires disclosure. Because if there is, and it's always a question that you need to ask clients when these business record checks come up, because, as I say, they've been picked for a reason, and, you know, it is always possible that the revenue have, you know, spotted something that you haven't about what's going on. But nonetheless, the important thing is to engage with the process. And my advice is always to say, I will take the phone call. In other words, you take the phone call rather than your clients, because in terms of the answers that they want, how many clients are actually going to know anything about how, you know, they sort of record business and private expenditure, for example, whereas you might be able to give a much more intelligent and sophisticated answer to that sort of question that will allay their fears, rather than just, no, I've got no idea. You sort of say, well, what actually happens is this, because we're able to identify, we tend to put all this private stuff in a box or whatever it might be. So you need to be the person who is the interface here. And also, if they do want to undertake a record examination, what they actually want to do is to examine them on site at the business premises. But they actually have no right to do that if you don't want them at the... And there may be very good reasons why, you know, and if they have a very small business premises and customers come to it, you probably don't want people examining your business record sort of in full view and all the rest of it. And so in all of those cases, you can say, all right, then yes, you can see the business records, but you have to come and see them here, or indeed you can deliver them and I'll talk to you about them, or whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be all on site and just the revenue and taxpayer being there. And it is very important, particularly because of penalties, as we'll see, that this is a line that is maintained.